The silence wasn't normal. It was the kind that sucks the oxygen out of a room and leaves everyone gasping for what comes next. Joy Behar sat frozen behind the glossy table of The View, her signature smirk completely erased, replaced by something no one had ever seen before on live television: genuine shock. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped her coffee mug, and for the first time in decades of hosting, words had completely abandoned her. The studio audience, just moments before erupting in their usual liberal applause, sat in stunned silence, some with their mouths literally hanging open. Camera operators zoomed in instinctively, knowing they were capturing television gold, the kind of raw moment that breaks the internet within hours. And there, standing with the quiet confidence of a man who had faced down Boston street corners and Hollywood boardrooms alike, was Mark Wahlberg. His weathered hands rested calmly at his sides, rosary beads barely visible beneath his simple button-down shirt, and his eyes held something that made even the most hardened New York media veterans take notice. He wasn't angry. He wasn't defensive. He was something far more dangerous to the established order. He was absolutely certain. The man who had transformed from Marky Mark to one of Hollywood's most respected actors had just delivered a line so devastating, so perfectly timed, that it would echo across social media platforms for weeks and force an entire industry to confront a truth they'd been avoiding for decades. But this wasn't just another celebrity dust-up or political theater designed for viral clips. This was the moment when authentic faith collided with performative skepticism, when street-smart Boston wisdom met elite coastal condescension, and when one man's refusal to be ashamed of his beliefs changed the entire trajectory of a live television show. What Mark said in those crucial 30 seconds didn't just silence Joy Behar, it awakened something in millions of viewers who had been waiting their entire lives for someone to speak their truth on the biggest stage in daytime television. The cameras caught every micro-expression, every uncomfortable shift in the co-hosts' chairs, every gasp from an audience that suddenly realized they weren't just watching entertainment, they were witnessing a cultural earthquake in real time. And Mark Wahlberg, the former rapper turned actor turned unlikely spiritual warrior, stood at the epicenter of it all, completely unfazed by the chaos he had just unleashed with words so simple, yet so powerful, that they would be quoted in churches, shared in Facebook groups, and debated in college classrooms for months to come. What happened next would prove that sometimes the most profound revolutions begin not with shouting or protests, but with one person having the courage to speak their truth with such clarity and conviction that it forces everyone else in the room to confront their own. And his name was Mark Wahlberg. If you believe that authentic faith and genuine transformation still matter in today's world, smash that like button and let us know in the comments, because what Mark said next will completely change how you see the power of standing firm in your beliefs. And don't forget to subscribe, because the next 6 parts of this story will reveal exactly how one man's unwavering faith brought one of television's toughest hosts to tears. But before that moment that would send shockwaves through Hollywood and inspire millions of believers worldwide, something much quieter happened. Something that would reveal the true character of both players in this unfolding drama. It started 3 weeks earlier with a phone call that Mark Wahlberg almost didn't take. His publicist, Sarah, had been hesitant to even mention it. "The View wants you on," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone that meant trouble. "They want to discuss your faith journey and how it influences your work in Hollywood." Mark was silent for a long moment, standing in his home gym in Beverly Hills, rosary beads hanging from the pull-up bar where he'd left them after his morning prayers. "They want a sound bite," Sarah continued, flipping through her notes. "Joy's been particularly vocal lately about celebrity faith being a publicity stunt. I think they're setting you up, Mark. They want you to either back down from your beliefs or come across as some kind of religious fanatic." Mark's team had seen this playbook before. Invite the openly faithful celebrity, create a hostile environment, then edit the footage to make them look either weak or extreme. It was a win-win for the hosts. Either way, they got their viral moment and their target got diminished. But Mark Wahlberg wasn't just any celebrity. This was a man who attended daily mass, who credited his Catholic faith with literally saving his life, and who had spent decades quietly funding inner-city programs and supporting at-risk youth without seeking cameras or credit. "Book it," he told Sarah, and she could hear something in his voice that made her pause. Not anger, not defiance, but something far more powerful, complete peace with whatever was coming. They think they know who I am because of Marky Mark or because I've played tough guys in movies. But they have no idea what real strength looks like. As word spread through Hollywood's gossip networks, the reactions split exactly along the lines you'd expect. Liberal celebrities and media figures whispered warnings to each other. Mark's going to get destroyed. Joy's going to eat him alive. This is going to be embarrassing. Conservative voices in the industry, the ones who usually stayed quiet, began paying attention. Text messages flew between agents and managers. Finally, someone with the guts to walk into the lion's den. But Mark himself seemed completely unaffected by the building storm. He continued his daily routine, 4 a.m. mass, workout, family time, work, as if he was preparing for just another day at the office. The night before the appearance, his longtime friend and fellow Catholic actor Jim Caviezel called him. "You sure about this, brother?" Jim asked. "These people aren't looking for a conversation. They're looking for a scalp." Mark's response would later be remembered by everyone who heard it. "Jim, I've been preparing for this moment my whole life. Not this show, but this moment. When someone tries to shame you for believing in something bigger than yourself, you have a choice. You can shrink or you can grow. I'm done shrinking." What Mark didn't tell anyone, not even his closest advisors, was that he had been praying specifically for this kind of opportunity. Not to be attacked, but to be given a platform where his faith could speak for itself. In his private journal, he had written just days before, "Lord, if you want me to be your voice in places where you're not welcome, I'm ready. Just give me the words when the time comes." As his car pulled up to the ABC studios in Manhattan that morning, Mark touched the rosary in his pocket and whispered a prayer that would prove more prophetic than he could have imagined. "Let them see you through me." The stage was set for what would become the most talked-about confrontation in daytime TV history, but what Mark walked into that studio with wasn't just confidence, it was something that would change everything. Hit that like button if you can already feel the power of what's coming, and drop a comment with your favorite prayer or inspirational quote, because you're about to witness faith in action like you've never seen before. Don't forget to subscribe because Section 3 reveals the first shot Joy fired, and Mark's response that made everyone in that studio realize they were dealing with someone completely different. The moment Mark Wahlberg walked onto that stage, you could feel the energy shift like a storm front moving in. He wasn't wearing the typical Hollywood guest uniform of designer suits and nervous smiles. Instead, he appeared in his signature casual button-down, dark jeans, and the kind of quiet confidence that comes from a man who has nothing to prove but everything to share. As he shook hands with each co-host, the cameras caught something the producers hadn't expected: genuine warmth from the audience. These weren't his typical fans. This was a New York studio filled with liberal viewers, yet something about his authentic presence cut through the political lines that usually divided rooms like this. Joy Behar, sitting in her power position at the center of the table, watched him settle into the guest chair with the calculating eyes of a predator sizing up prey. She had spent 30 years perfecting the art of the verbal ambush, and today's target was sitting just 3 feet away, completely relaxed, hands folded calmly in his lap. The opening pleasantries were standard television theater compliments about his latest movie, jokes about Boston sports, the kind of surface-level banter that puts guests at ease before the real agenda begins. But even during these safe exchanges, viewers who knew what to look for could see Joy's tells. The way she shuffled her note cards just a little too frequently. The slightly forced nature of her laughter. "So Mark," Joy began, her voice carrying that deceptively light tone that veterans of The View recognized as the setup pitch, "I have to ask about something that's always fascinated me about you." The word, fascinated, hung in the air with just enough sarcasm to be noticed but not enough to be called out. "You're one of the few actors in Hollywood who's very open about being religious. You go to church every day, you carry rosary beads, you talk about prayer like it's as real as breakfast." A few audience members shifted uncomfortably, sensing the trap being laid. "I mean, in 2024, with everything we know about science and psychology, don't you think it's time we evolved past these fairy tale beliefs?" The studio went pin-drop silent. Not the comfortable silence of anticipation, but the sharp, electric quiet that comes when everyone realizes a line has been crossed. Joy had done exactly what Mark's team had predicted. She had taken his most deeply held beliefs and dismissed them as childish fantasies on national television. The cameras zoomed in on Mark's face, expecting to catch embarrassment, anger, or at least discomfort. Instead, they found something that would haunt Joy Behar for weeks afterward: a slight smile. Not mocking, not defensive, but the kind of peaceful expression that comes from a man who has walked through fire and emerged stronger. Mark leaned forward slightly, not aggressively, but with the body language of someone about to share something important. "Joy," he said, his Boston accent adding weight to each word, "I've been called a lot of things in my life. Street thug, has-been rapper, pretty boy actor. But you know what nobody's ever called me? Stupid." The audience stirred, sensing that this wasn't going to be the easy takedown they had been expecting. "See, I've lived in the real world. I've been in the gutter and I've been on top of mountains. I've seen what happens when people have nothing to believe in, and I've seen what happens when they find something worth dying for." He paused, letting that sink in, and then delivered the line that would become the first viral moment of the interview. "You call faith a fairy tale, but the only fairy tale I've seen is the one where people think they can save themselves." The words landed like thunderclaps in the studio. Audience members who had come prepared to laugh at the religious celebrity instead found themselves leaning forward, hanging on every word. Joy's prepared comeback died in her throat as she realized that Mark Wahlberg wasn't just defending his beliefs, he was making her question hers. But Mark wasn't finished. He had waited decades for this moment, and he wasn't going to waste it. "You want to talk about evolution, Joy? I used to beat people unconscious for looking at me wrong. I used to think strength meant making other people afraid of you. But real evolution isn't abandoning what makes you better, it's embracing it. And my faith didn't make me weak. It made me dangerous to everything that was killing me." The camera caught Joy blinking rapidly, her confident smirk replaced by something that looked uncomfortably like uncertainty, and viewers across America realized they weren't just watching television anymore, they were watching a masterclass in unshakable conviction. This is where everything changes, and if you're feeling that power building, smash that like button and comment "Faith wins" to let us know you're with Mark so far. The next section reveals Joy's desperate attempt to regain control, but what Mark says next will leave her speechless and prove that some truths are more powerful than any attack. Subscribe right now because you won't want to miss a single word of what's coming next. Joy Behar had spent 3 decades in television, and she knew when an interview was slipping away from her. The confident smirk that had been her trademark was nowhere to be found, replaced by the tight-lipped expression of someone who had just discovered their opponent wasn't playing by the expected rules. Her co-hosts exchanged glances that the cameras caught, the kind of looks that said, "This isn't going according to plan." But Joy wasn't the queen of daytime controversy for nothing. If gentle mockery wouldn't break Mark Wahlberg, she would reach for sharper weapons from her arsenal of personal destruction. "That's a beautiful story, Mark," she said, her voice dripping with condescension as she shuffled through her note cards like a prosecutor preparing for cross-examination. "But let's be honest here. It's easy to preach about redemption and transformation when you're sitting in a Beverly Hills mansion worth $50 million. The studio audience shifted uncomfortably, sensing that Joy was about to cross lines that would make everyone squirm. "I mean, convenient timing, don't you think? You find religion right around the time you become successful? Almost like insurance." The accusation hung in the air like poison gas, and Mark's expression didn't change by even a fraction. He had been expecting this exact attack, had probably heard variations of it whispered behind his back at Hollywood parties for years. But instead of defending his wealth or his timing, he did something that caught Joy completely off guard. He smiled. Not the defensive smile of someone caught in an uncomfortable truth, but the knowing smile of someone who had walked through fire and come out purified. "Joy," Mark said, his voice carrying the weight of lived experience, "you think money makes faith easier? Let me tell you something about being rich and religious in Hollywood. It makes you a target. It makes you weird. It makes people question every movie role, every business decision, every friendship." He leaned forward, his intensity building but his voice remaining controlled. "I could have kept my mouth shut, gone to church quietly, and avoided conversations like this one. But that's not what my faith asks of me. But Joy wasn't finished with her character assassination. She had prepared for this moment, done her research, and she was about to deploy what she thought was her nuclear weapon. Speaking of your past, Mark, let's talk about what you were really like before this convenient conversion. Hate crimes, Mark. Assault charges. You literally blinded a man in a racially motivated attack when you were younger. The words hit the studio like a physical blow. Audience members gasped audibly. Camera operators instinctively zoomed in, expecting to capture Mark's face crumbling under the weight of his darkest moments being broadcast to millions. Instead, they captured something that would become one of the most powerful moments in television history. Mark Wahlberg didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He didn't make excuses. He stared directly into Joy's eyes and said, "You're absolutely right. I was a monster." The admission hit the room like a lightning strike, but Mark wasn't finished. "I was filled with hate, rage, and self-destruction. I hurt innocent people because I was broken inside. And you know what, Joy? That's exactly why I needed saving." The transformation in the room was immediate and palpable. What Joy had intended as a killing blow had become Mark's most powerful testimony. "You think bringing up my past hurts me? It doesn't. It proves my point. The man who did those things is dead. Not metaphorically dead, literally dead. My faith didn't erase what I did, but it killed who I was and raised up someone new." His voice grew stronger with each word, and the audience found themselves leaning forward, drawn by the raw authenticity of a man owning his darkness to prove the power of his light. Joy's face had gone pale. Her prepared follow-up questions seemed suddenly inadequate, even cruel. She had expected Mark to crumble under the weight of his past, to become defensive or angry. Instead, he had transformed her attack into a masterclass on redemption that was leaving viewers across America in tears. The control room was frantically gesturing for a commercial break, but the moment was too powerful, too raw, too real to interrupt. Mark Wahlberg had just done something unprecedented on live television. He had turned his greatest shame into his most compelling witness. And Joy Behar was beginning to realize she hadn't just lost control of the interview. She had walked into a spiritual hurricane. If Mark's courage to own his past and prove the power of transformation is moving you, hit that like button and comment, "Redeemed," to show your support for second chances. What happens next will completely destroy Joy's confidence and prove that authentic change is more powerful than any attack. But you have to subscribe to see how Mark turns this entire show upside down with what he says next. The silence that followed Mark's admission about being a monster stretched across the studio like a taut wire ready to snap. Joy Behar sat frozen, her arsenal of prepared attacks suddenly feeling like children's toys in the face of Mark's devastating honesty. She had expected deflection, excuses, maybe even anger, but not this raw, unflinching ownership of darkness that somehow radiated more light than anything she had ever witnessed on her own show. The co-hosts looked like deer caught in headlights, their usual quick-witted interjections nowhere to be found. Even the audience seemed to be holding its collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something that transcended typical daytime television drama. But Mark Wahlberg wasn't finished. He had spent decades preparing for this moment, not consciously, but through every early morning mass, every rosary prayer, every quiet act of service that the cameras never captured. Now, with millions watching, he was about to do something that would change the trajectory of the entire conversation. He turned slightly away from Joy and looked directly into the camera, addressing the viewers at home with the kind of direct, unfiltered honesty that Hollywood had trained out of most celebrities years ago. "There's someone watching this right now," Mark said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper but somehow carrying more power than any shout, "who thinks they're too broken to be fixed. Maybe you've done things you can't take back. Maybe you've hurt people you loved. Maybe you look in the mirror and see nothing but failure and regret." The camera operator, recognizing the moment's significance, held the shot steady on Mark's face as his eyes seemed to pierce through the lens and into living rooms across America. "I'm here to tell you that's a lie. Not because I'm special, not because I'm better than you, but because I've been where you are." Joy attempted to regain control, her voice cutting through Mark's moment with the sharpness of desperation. "That's very touching, Mark, but we're not in church here. This is television. People tune in for reality, not for religious recruitment. The words were meant to diminish him, to reduce his testimony to mere performance, but they had the opposite effect. A murmur rippled through the audience, not of agreement with Joy, but of uncomfortable recognition that she had just trivialized something sacred. Several audience members visibly recoiled, and one woman in the third row shook her head in visible disappointment. Mark's response was immediate and devastating. He stood up slowly, not in anger or theatrics, but with the quiet authority of a man who had found his ground and refused to be moved from it. "You're right, Joy. This isn't church. But that doesn't mean truth stops being true just because we're on television." His words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and the studio seemed to shrink around his presence. "You want reality? Here's reality. 25 years ago, I was heading toward prison or death. Today, I employ hundreds of people, I've helped build schools in inner cities, and I've raised 4 kids who know the difference between right and wrong. That's not religious recruitment, that's transformation." The moment that followed would be replayed millions of times across social media platforms. From the back of the studio audience, a young man stood up. He was maybe 25 years old, wearing a simple hoodie, and his voice shook as he spoke. "Mr. Wahlberg," he said, and the entire studio turned to look at him. "I've been struggling with addiction for 3 years. I came here today with my mom because she loves this show, but listening to you, I think I want to try again. I think I want to get clean." The studio went dead silent. Joy's mouth opened and closed without sound. The cameras frantically tried to capture both Mark's reaction and the young man's tear-streaked face. Mark walked directly to the audience member, ignoring protocol, ignoring the stunned production crew, ignoring everything except the human being in front of him who had just made himself vulnerable on live television. "What's your name, son?" Mark asked, and when the young man whispered, "David," Mark placed a hand on his shoulder and said words that would echo in recovery centers across the country. "David, your story isn't over. It's just beginning." The audience erupted, not in applause, but in something deeper. Half the studio was crying. The other half was standing. And Joy Behar, the woman who had started this interview intending to humiliate a man for his faith, sat powerless as she watched authentic transformation happen in real time. In that moment, the power dynamic didn't just shift, it completely inverted. Mark Wahlberg had turned The View into something it had never been before. A place where broken people could find hope, where shame could be transformed into strength, and where one man's refusal to be ashamed of his beliefs could spark genuine change in the lives of strangers. Joy knew she had lost more than control of her show. She had lost the argument before she even realized what they were really fighting about. If David's courage and Mark's response just gave you chills, smash that like button and comment, "Hope lives," because what you just witnessed was the power of authentic transformation changing lives in real time. Subscribe immediately because the next section reveals Joy's complete emotional breakdown and Mark's response that will restore your faith in human decency. You cannot miss what happens next. What happened next broke Joy Behar completely. As Mark returned to his seat after embracing David, something in Joy's face cracked. Not her usual comedic mask, but something deeper, the armor she had built over 30 years of dismissing what other people held sacred. Her hands trembled as she reached for her water glass, and when she spoke, her voice carried a tremor that millions of viewers had never heard before. "You think you're so righteous," she whispered, but there was no fight left in it. "You think your little fairy tale makes you better than the rest of us." The words were meant to wound, but they sounded hollow, desperate, like the last gasps of someone drowning. Mark looked at her not with triumph, but with something that made the entire studio hold its breath, genuine compassion for the woman who had spent the last 20 minutes trying to destroy him. "Joy," Mark said softly, and the gentleness in his voice after everything she had thrown at him made several audience members audibly gasp. "I don't think I'm better than anyone. But I know what it's like to hate yourself so much that you lash out at anything that threatens to heal you." The words hit her like a physical blow. Her coffee mug slipped from her shaking hands and shattered on the floor, the sound echoing through the dead-silent studio like a gunshot. And then Joy Behar, the woman who had built a career on never showing weakness, never backing down, never admitting she was wrong, began to cry. Not the manufactured tears of television drama, but the raw, ugly sobs of someone whose walls had just collapsed on live television. "I haven't believed in anything in 40 years, she choked out between sobs. "I've spent so long tearing down what other people believe that I forgot what it felt like to hope." Mark stood again, but this time he walked not away from her, but toward her. In front of millions of viewers, he knelt beside Joy's chair and did something that would be replayed in churches and shared in recovery meetings for decades to come. He took her hand gently and said the 5 words that would end the interview and begin Joy's transformation. "It's never too late, Joy." The studio didn't erupt in applause. They didn't cheer or whistle or celebrate Joy's defeat. Instead, they did something far more powerful. They witnessed. They watched as 30 years of cynicism melted away in 30 seconds, as authentic grace conquered manufactured outrage, and as Mark Wahlberg proved that sometimes the most radical thing you can do is forgive your enemy on live television. In the control room, producers scrambled to figure out how to end this segment that had become something no one had ever planned for. But it didn't matter. Mark had already won something bigger than any argument. He had won a soul. If you just witnessed the power of grace conquering hate and it moved your heart, smash that like button and comment. Grace wins because the final section reveals what happened after the cameras stopped rolling and Joy's complete transformation that shocked everyone. Subscribe now because you need to see how this story ends and what it means for all of us. The cameras stopped rolling, but the transformation had only just begun. Joy Behar, still wiping tears from her eyes, looked up at Mark with something no one had ever seen before: humility. "How do you do it?" she whispered. "How do you forgive someone like me?" Mark's answer would later be quoted in thousands of sermons. "The same way I was forgiven. Completely." Within hours, the internet exploded. #MarkWahlbergTruth became the #1 trending topic worldwide. Churches across America requested permission to show the footage during Sunday services. Recovery centers played it for their patients. The clip of Mark kneeling beside Joy hit 50 million views in 24 hours, becoming the most watched daytime television moment in history. But the real story wasn't the viral fame, it was what happened behind the scenes. Joy Behar, the woman who had mocked faith as a fairy tale, asked Mark to pray with her before he left the studio. David, the young man who stood up about his addiction, entered rehab the next day with Mark personally covering the costs. 3 other audience members approached Mark afterward, sharing their own stories of pain and asking for hope. 6 months later, Joy made an announcement that shocked the entertainment world. She was taking a sabbatical from The View to rediscover what really matters. She began attending church quietly, volunteering at homeless shelters, and speaking at recovery meetings about the day her cynicism died on live television. The woman who had spent decades tearing down faith became its unlikely defender. Mark never boasted about what happened. He never wrote a book about it or took credit for Joy's transformation. When asked by reporters about that day, he simply said, "I didn't change anyone. Truth changes people. I just had the privilege of speaking it when it was needed most." The ripple effects continue today. The View changed its format to include more meaningful conversations. David celebrated 2 years of sobriety and started his own recovery ministry. Joy Behar became living proof that it's never too late to believe in something bigger than yourself. And Mark Wahlberg? He went back to his daily routine, 4 a.m. Mass, family time, and quietly changing lives one conversation at a time. Because sometimes the most powerful revolutions happen not with violence or anger, but with one person refusing to be ashamed of love, grace, and the belief that broken people can be made whole. The fairy tale wasn't faith after all. The fairy tale was thinking we could save ourselves. If this story of transformation, grace, and second chances has moved your heart, smash that like button and comment. Transformation is real, to let us know you believe in the power of authentic change. Subscribe for more incredible true stories that prove faith, hope, and love still change the world. Because stories like this remind us that miracles happen when we least expect them.